In January of 1974, cotton reached 89 cents a pound. The International Monetary Fund, reviewing the world cotton market a few years later, called that an all-time peak and noted that through the entire 1960s, cotton had traded in a narrow band of about 27 to 33 cents. In that same winter, the price of crude oil roughly quadrupled. Both of the fibers in the American closet got expensive at once, and then in 1975, in the middle of the Great Inflation, one line in the household budget went down. Not slower, down. The wholesale price of textiles and clothing in the United States peaked in the summer of 1974 at just under 70 on the Bureau of Labor Statistics Index, and by the spring of the following year, it had fallen about 5.5%, while the price of nearly everything else a family bought kept climbing. That was not good news. It is one of the clearest pieces of evidence we have of how badly households were hurting, because the clothes hanging in an American closet in 1974 were not, in any meaningful economic sense, cloth. They were oil. Start with the fabric itself, because almost nobody thinks of it as a petroleum product, and it is one. Polyester was discovered in 1941 in England by two chemists named John Rex Winfield and James Tennant Dixon, working for the Calico Printers Association. The work was held secret until after the war. Imperial Chemical Industries took it to market as Terylene. DuPont bought the American rights, and from 1951, DuPont sold it under the name Dacron. What those chemists had actually built was a way of making a fiber out of two industrial chemicals: terephthalic acid, which comes from paraxylene, straight out of the oil refinery, and ethylene glycol, which comes from ethylene, cracked from natural gas liquids and refinery naphtha. Both of them are hydrocarbon feedstocks. Both of them reprice when energy reprices. So a polyester shirt is a barrel of oil minus several steps. Nothing about that is a metaphor. For most of the century, that would have been a curiosity, because most American clothing was cotton and wool. Then, in the space of about 15 years, that stopped being true. Cotton Incorporated, the cotton industry's own research and marketing body, keeps the count, and by its reckoning, cotton apparel and home fabrics made up about 78% of all textile products sold at retail in the United States in 1960. By 1975, that share had fallen to 34%, which the industry records as an all-time low. 2/3 of what Americans bought at retail was no longer cotton, and the single biggest reason was polyester. It had happened for reasons that had nothing to do with oil. Polyester did not wrinkle. It did not need ironing. It came out of the dryer ready to wear. It held a crease for years, and it was cheap. For a household running on one paycheck and one person's unpaid labor, permanent press was not a fashion statement. It was time. And then, on the 19th of October, 1973, 2 days after the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries announced production cuts, and on the day President Nixon asked Congress for emergency aid to Israel, the oil embargo reached the United States. What that did to the price of crude is one of the sharpest breaks in the whole economic record. The Federal Reserve's own history of the episode puts the world price at $2.90 a barrel before the embargo, and $11.65 by January of 1974. Inside the United States, where crude was under price controls, the effect still came through hard. The Energy Information Administration's figures show the average cost of crude oil to American refiners going from $4.15 a barrel in 1973 to $9.07 in 1974, with imported crude at $12.52. Everyone remembers what that did at the gas pump. The gas lines are the single most photographed image of the 1970s. What almost nobody traced was the second bill, the one that arrived in the fabric store and the department store, because the feedstock for polyester had just repriced along with everything else that comes out of a barrel. Now, a reasonable person in 1974 would have said, "Fine, then buy cotton." And here is the cruelty of that particular year. You could not. That 89 cents a pound, the all-time peak in the International Monetary Fund's review, arrived in January of 1974. The same month, the world oil price hit $11.65. The natural fiber and the synthetic fiber, which had spent 20 years competing with each other and holding each other's prices down, went up together in the same winter for entirely different reasons. There was no cheaper thing to switch to. For the American household, both doors closed in the same 3 months. You can watch the bill arrive at Wholesale. The Bureau of Labor Statistics Producer Price Index for textile products and apparel sat at about 55.5 in 1972 on the index where 1982 equals 100. That is the price of the goods before they reach a store at the mill and the manufacturer level. In 1973, it was about 60.5. In 1974, it was about 68. That is a rise of a little over 12% in a single year and about 22% across 2, in an industry whose prices had risen by roughly 1% a year through the 1960s. So the cost was real, and it was large, and it was documented. Which brings us to the strange part. It never fully reached the price tag. The Consumer Price Index for apparel and upkeep, what households actually paid at the register, rose about 7.5% in 1974. In that same year, the Consumer Price Index for everything rose about 11%. Food rose faster still. Energy far faster. Clothing, the category made out of the very thing that had just quadrupled, was one of the slowest rising major lines in the American budget in the worst inflation year the country had seen since 1947. The obvious explanation is that somebody in the middle absorbed the difference, and to a degree, somebody did. The gap between a 12% rise at the mill and a 7.5% rise at the register came out of the margins of textile manufacturers, garment makers, and retailers. And that is a large part of why 1974 and 1975 were brutal years in the American textile business. But margins are not the whole answer. And the rest of the answer is the reason this is a story about a household ledger and not about an industry. Retailers stopped short of passing the full cost along, and the reason the arithmetic gives is that Americans had stopped buying clothes. The Bureau of Economic Analysis measures what the country spent on clothing and footwear. In the national accounts as they stand today, that figure was about $59 billion in 1973 and about $62 billion in 1974. A rise of a little over 5% in dollars in a year when the prices of those same goods rose about 7.5%. Spend 5% more on something that costs 7.5% more, and you come home with less of it. The Bureau measures that directly too in a quantity index that strips the prices out, and it shows the volume of clothing and footwear Americans bought, falling about 2% in 1974, and they kept going. Clothing and footwear had been about 7% of everything American consumers spent in 1973. By 1975, it was about 6.5%. Half a percentage point sounds like nothing. Across the whole country, it was billions of dollars of clothing that simply was not purchased, and inside any one house, it looked like something very ordinary. It looked like the coat lasting a 4th winter. It looked like the hem coming down on a school dress instead of the dress being replaced. It looked like the good shoes being resoled twice. A younger child wore an older child's clothes. A father wore the same 2 suits to work for 5 years. And a wife decided in September that the children needed shoes more than she needed a coat, which is the decision that never appears in any statistic anywhere. This is the thing about the clothing line in a household budget. And it is why it behaves so differently from the grocery line. Food cannot be postponed. A family eats this week or it does not. The bank has a schedule for the mortgage payment, and the schedule does not move. Heating oil in January in Ohio has a deadline set by the weather. But clothing can be postponed almost indefinitely, one garment at a time, without anything visibly breaking. There is no due date on a new coat. Nobody shuts off a winter jacket for non-payment. So when a household ran out of room in 1974, the clothing line is where the squeeze went first, because it was the only line that would take it quietly. The Bureau of Labor Statistics measured real spendable weekly earnings falling that year. The money coming in bought less than it had. And the apparel line in a 1974 ledger looks disciplined. It was not discipline, it was deferral. And deferral is a debt paid later, in a closet that gets thinner every season. Households did more than defer, of course. They sewed, they mended, they let out seams, they cut down adult clothes into children's clothes. None of it was free. It was hours, and the hours were almost entirely women's hours, and they were spent because the alternative had gotten expensive. And there is one more thing households did, which is the quiet joke at the center of this whole story. They bought more polyester, because when a family has to choose between a cotton shirt that needs ironing and wears out in 2 seasons, and a polyester one that costs less, never wrinkles, and refuses to dye, a household under pressure buys the one that lasts. The fiber made of oil was, at the household level, the coping mechanism for the oil shock, which is my own read on why the leisure suit and the double-knit wardrobe took over the decade so completely. It is not merely that the 1970s had bad taste. It is that squeezed households bought the most durable, cheapest, lowest maintenance clothing available to them and then wore it for years because they could not afford to replace it. Which brings us back to the number this all started with, and to why a falling price was a bad sign. By late 1974, the American economy had turned into a full recession, the deepest downturn since the 1930s as of that point. The National Bureau of Economic Research dates it from November of 1973 to March of 1975, 16 months, with unemployment reaching 9% in May of 1975. And the textile industry, which had just spent a year paying quadrupled prices for its raw material, found that it had manufactured a great deal of cloth that no one was coming in to buy. The wholesale price index for textiles and apparel peaked in the summer of 1974 at just under 70. By the spring of 1975, it was just under 66. Mills cut shifts. The double-knit polyester boom, one of the most profitable things in American textiles a year earlier, collapsed, and capacity that had been running flat out in 1973 sat idle. That decline in the index was not the oil shock ending. Crude oil did not go back down. The average cost of crude to American refiners rose again in 1975 to $10.38 a barrel, higher than the year before. The input cost stayed. What broke was the demand. Prices fell because the country had stopped buying, and an industry facing empty order books will sell below its own costs before it will sit idle. So the one line in the family budget that beat inflation in 1975 did so because millions of families had already stopped filling it in. I think that falling index is one of the most misread numbers of the decade. It looks like relief. It is the opposite, and the spending data is what shows you the difference. Now, this is a channel about reading ledgers honestly. So let me be honest about what the clothing line does and does not tell you. It does not tell you what a family owned. It does not tell you what they went without. A grocery ledger is close to complete because groceries get bought every week and written down every week. The apparel line is the opposite. It is a record of the purchases that survived the household's own editing. And what is interesting about that line in the 1970s is what is not written on it. If you know how the cloth was made, you can read the missing entries backward. Crude oil quadruples in the winter of 1973 and 1974. Cotton hits its all-time peak in the same January. Wholesale cloth rises 12% in a year. The register price rises only 7.5%, and the volume of clothing American households actually bought falls. Those 5 facts only fit together one way. The cost was real, it arrived on schedule, and instead of appearing as a bigger number in the budget, it disappeared into a smaller wardrobe. That is the polyester premium, not a line item anybody wrote down. A shirt quietly made of the same thing as the gasoline, in a year when both got expensive, bought by a household that had already decided the shirt could wait. The mechanism did not retire with the decade. Apparel is still the most postponable line in an American household budget, and it is still the first line to go quiet when the other ones will not. When clothing spending flattens while everything else climbs, that flat column is not a household that got disciplined. It is a household that ran out of room somewhere else and put the coat off one more winter. There are still 1974 ledgers in American attics with a clothing column that looks almost flat. It is the calmest column on the page. It is also, once you know what a polyester shirt was made of and what a barrel of oil cost that January, the loudest. What the mending and the remaking on the other side of that column were actually worth in hours and in dollars is its own ledger. And that one is on the channel.